I'm Bob and I like to make stuff. Today I'm going to make a resin rolling pin with 3D printing. A while back I had the idea of making a rolling pin out of epoxy, but I also wanted to take advantage of some of the unused plastic around a 3D print. So the original idea was to take all the spaghetti and the unused parts of the 3D prints, embed it in the epoxy, and then turn it on the lathe. The more I thought about it though, I realized that the infill on the inside of a 3D printed object would actually be really cool because it's this geometric pattern that carries throughout the object. So I started out by doing some tests, modeling up some shapes with some triangular infill to use as the inside of the rolling pin. This is a small example of it with the infill, and you can see the pattern here, and it kind of works from that direction, but from the side it's just too dense. You lose all of the detail and all the geometry. So we've got another idea to print something that's going to work really well on the inside of the rolling pin. Here's where we ended up with the 3D printed object. This is actually a 2-for-1. We've got a spiral that's going to run the length of the rolling pin, but it's also printed inside a cylinder that's going to act as the mold. So the next step is to seal up the outside of the mold to make it watertight and mix up some epoxy. We're going to use some clear packing tape to wrap this, and it's not going to make it 100% watertight, but it should work well enough to keep the epoxy in until it starts to set up. So I'm just going to wrap this all the way around, then we'll set this in a container to catch any spillover. I'm going to go around here and just try to press down the tape as much as I can to seal it. It's not going to be perfect, like I mentioned before, but it should do all right. Also left the tape a little proud of the top so that any of the epoxy that's extra, if it expands, will get caught up here and hopefully make less of a mess. This is a 2-part epoxy, and it's a 1-to-1 mix, so I'm just going to fill up 32 ounces of one and 32 ounces of the other and mix them together. And this particular type of epoxy is kind of made to be able to do really big pours like this. It doesn't get too hot as it cures. And in case you're curious about resins, we did a whole bits video on different types of resins, epoxy and a bunch of other ones. You may want to check that out, we'll give a link to it. Every brand is a little bit different, but this one says that it gets cloudy once you mix the 2 parts together, and then you just mix until it starts to clear up. All right, it's looking pretty clear on here, so we're gonna go ahead and pour it. This thing is completely cured. Now we're ready to put it on the lathe, but first we have to get 2 flat ends. The epoxy sunk down a little bit as it cured, so we've got to flatten off this end. We also have to take off this end, and we're going to do that on the bandsaw. I went to put it on the lathe and realized that there's 3D printed material right in the center point, and that's where I need the point on the lathe to go. That's going to make the point on the lathe drift off to one of the sides. So instead I'm going to try to drill out right in the center point so that I can get this entire thing centered on the lathe. This thing is too tall to put into the drill press. I think that would be the best way to do it, because then the hole would be coming straight down. You can put it exactly where you want it. Unfortunately it just won't fit in there, so I'm going to do it with the Dremel. All right, this thing is actually working all right. It's really messy, but it is working. We're getting through the outer shell. Just got a little bit more to do, and we can start actually shaping it. I've never turned epoxy before, and it's pretty cool, but one thing that's kind of weird with this much of it is this entire cylinder has a little bit of flex to it. And so since it's so long, as it spins, it's kind of wobbling in and out. So you can't really get it down to a perfect cylinder. I'm gonna do the best that I can, but just when it gets up to speed, it starts kind of bending in the middle. It's really strange. So if you turn this much epoxy, be careful. This thing's just about done. The last thing is to put a coating on it to get rid of all the cloudiness and some of the uneven marks here. I've not had a lot of luck in the past trying to polish epoxy, although some other resins you can polish up really nicely. So for this one, I'm actually gonna put it back on the lathe and paint on a really thin coat of the same epoxy so that it can dry and be nice and clear on the outside. The other thing about painting on the epoxy is that it's going to give a final coating that's going to cover up this plastic that's exposed. That's probably not a big deal. It's PLA, it's biodegradable, it's not going to hurt you, but this way it will be covered up with epoxy, and once that epoxy cures fully, it will definitely be food safe. The epoxy is all cured up, and this thing looks really, really cool. I'm happy with it. There are some lines in it, like I mentioned before. From the turning, it kind of flopped around a little bit, so if you really wanted to get it perfectly flat, you'd probably want to put on a coat of epoxy on the outside of it, sand it, another coat, sand it, and just do back and forth until you get a really flat surface. But for me, this is going to be good enough for dough. As an experiment, this thing turned out really cool. We learned a whole lot about 3D printing a mold and an object on the inside of it. I learned a lot about pouring this much epoxy at one time. And actually, on that subject matter, you may be wondering if this is food safe. Just about anything is food safe once it's fully cured. So as long as you wait for epoxy to fully cure, it's not going to leach into the food that you use it on. I've got a whole lot of other project videos that you may be interested in. Be sure to check some of those out. And if you're not subscribed, go ahead and do that right there. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Outside of this, to hold the epoxy, mix up the epoxy and fill it.
You said epoxy.
I know I did. Mix some up, mix up the epoxy, pour it in, and mix up the epoxy and pour it in.